Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, U.S. troops are being forced to confront protesters exercising their constitutional rights.
For a lot of veterans, they see a country that might be moving away from even being a constitutional democracy anymore.
What happens when those in uniform are ordered to confront the very people they swore to protect? I'm Manuel Rapalo, and this is The Take. U.S. President Donald Trump has sent U.S. Marines and National Guard into Los Angeles against California Governor Gavin Newsom's wishes.
700 Marines are being sent too. The battle on the streets now heading for the courts. A furious California is suing the administration. Newsom saying Donald Trump's violation of the U.S. Constitution is an overstep of his authority. We will not let this stand.
Until now, these troops have faced thousands of demonstrations protesting immigration raids, sometimes head-on. A federal judge has already ruled the deployment of the National Guard as illegal, but that ruling was put on pause by a federal appeals court. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth says troops in LA are lawful and could remain on the ground for 60 days. But some have concerns. They've been tasked with defending the United States, but is pointing a gun at someone practicing their constitutional right to demonstrate on U.S. soil what they signed up to do. There's a hotline for that, a hotline for service members with those kinds of questions, and it's recently seen an uptick in calls.
GI Rights Hotline, this is Steve.
Steve Woolford answers those calls. He's a counselor for the GI Rights Hotline, a nonprofit that helps members of the military understand their rights, and we got him on the line to talk about just that.
We are getting calls that are different than what we normally get day in and day out. And most of those are involving people who either have already been sent to LA or are concerned that they might be. And to them, these aren't anti-war people or anti-military people, but to them, they feel like what they're being asked to do in terms of being armed amidst a population of their own fellow citizens just goes against what they ever thought of the job entailing in terms of defense. And like I said, these are people who have told me, I'm willing to go fight against another country that's attacking us, or even another country that's attacking some defenseless nation. But I'm not ready to be armed and taking away the constitutional rights of the American people. And that's I think, a new dilemma that isn't part of our everyday conversations.
I'm kind of just curious how you got into this line of work to begin with. Can you tell us that story?
I don't always go into my story with callers because I don't want them to feel like they've got to change anything about what they're saying to please me, or I don't want to really influence where they're going. But I will tell you that I was involved in some anti-war work and some different demonstrations. Mm-hmm. And at times I was part of groups that even went to military bases for demonstrations. I remember standing outside of there on one side of a fence and seeing soldiers who were doing their job of standing there looking back out at us from their side of the fence. And I didn't like the feeling that they were thinking maybe all these people have it in for them. I was really interested and started doing this work because it just felt like a way to connect as human beings, as opposed to that, like I said, just it felt too oppositional before.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Right. And some of the advice that folks are calling you for is legal advice, but you have said you're not a lawyer. What you are doing, though, is giving advice.
Right. So if somebody asks me for legal advice, I try to clarify right up front that we are not attorneys. When I try to be clear with people, when I answer this question, I'm not giving you legal advice like an attorney might. I'm sharing what I know as a resource counselor, and I'll share with you what other people have done in your situation, how it's gone, and things like that. And we try to be careful about making that clear.
I mean, we're talking today about this hotline specifically because National Guard troops were deployed to Los Angeles. This has to be confusing for a lot of these young enlisted service members. On June 12th, District Court Judge Charles Breyer said that this order by President Trump to send in the National Guard was illegal, saying that there was no danger of a rebellion. Hours later, an appeals court temporarily blocked that order by the district court judge. So I can imagine there's a lot of confusion here, given the fact that the National Guard is normally under the control of state governors, but now the President of the United States has called on the National Guard to provide assistance to ICE agents. What sort of confusion are you hearing from people when they call you?
Right. Well, I would say there's maybe two levels of confusion. There are some people who want to know what I'll call technical legal details. Oh, it was unjust because it didn't go through the governor. What does that mean? But for the average service member, they're saying things like, up until now, my understanding is I'm defending the Constitution and I'm protecting the country. And this feels like I'm being sent into a situation where maybe people are having completely legal protests happening. And I'm concerned somebody wants me to point a weapon at my fellow citizens who are doing something that to me looks like a constitutional right. So just on a basic level, they're like, this isn't what I thought I signed up for.
And what do you say when they say that? Because I imagine that that's sort of the line that you hear most often. This isn't what I signed up for.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, the first thing I used to try to do is say, I totally understand that. We're getting a lot of calls. You're not the only one who's really concerned about that. So I'm not going to tell somebody what to do, but I'm going to listen about their concerns and where they want to know more and how they feel about that. If someone asks a question, hey, are these legal orders? Am I obligated to follow them? I try to be honest with people and say that we've been in conversation with attorneys for a while in anticipation that things like this can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And the attorneys we talk to are really cautious. And they will say that they don't even know for sure how this is going to play out in the courts. Your everyday soldier is going to feel conflicted and confused. But if somebody's saying, do I have an airtight case here where if I just refuse these orders, can I count on them being recognized as illegal and I won't be subject to any punishments? And that's where I have to say to people, actually, the lawyers we talk to are very cautious and no one's ready to give that kind of assurance at this point. So I try to be honest with people that I can't really say I can't say who's going to win the legal interpretation battle.
Right.
And then we talk about, again, just what might be other avenues to deal with their concerns.
Right. And I want to talk about those other avenues that might be available for enlisted members of the armed forces here in the United States. But before we get into that, we were talking about this before the show today with the producers here on The Take about this interesting sort of intersection that exists on this topic right now, because all of this is sort of rooted in these ICE raids that have been taking place here in Los Angeles, where I am, and all over the city. And at the same time, it's like what we said was that serving in the armed forces, in many instances for people here in the United States who are not citizens, can be a pathway towards citizenship.
Army recruiters recently gave Mexican immigrant Jose Rubalcaba a $17,000 signing bonus to serve in the military and possibly in Iraq after he graduates high school.
And I know that you've gotten calls from enlisted service members who are not citizens yet, but are being put in a situation where essentially they're helping ICE agents detain immigrants here in the United States. A situation that they themselves could find themselves in. What do you do in that scenario?
Well, in terms of what I do, again, I can't make decisions for people. And I certainly can't change immigration policy, but I understand, I'm sympathetic with people who, some of them are Californians. So there's people who join the National Guard and even the active duty military. You have to have a green card to join, but you don't have to be a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who join from families that may have some documented family members and some undocumented family members.
Have you had those situations where somebody calls up and they're having to maybe confront or help ICE agents go after a family member?
I don't know whether there have been people in that situation, but people say to me, what concerns me is that I could see that happening. These orders make me worry that I could be doing that. And they're concerned enough that they want to try to figure something out before they're in that exact moment of, wait, that's my uncle.
It could happen. Yeah.
It could happen. And I think a lot of people, when they join the military, I don't think recruiters sit down and say, we could use you to help deport your undocumented family members. That's not the sales pitch.
That's not going to sell it. Right. Yeah. That's not a good selling point for enlisting in the armed forces here in the United States. So, Steve, Major General Scott Sherman of the U.S. Army said in a press briefing that soldiers would not be acting as police.
They do not do any arrest. They are strictly there to detain, to wait for law enforcement to come and handle those demonstrators.
Reuters has reported that the military has detained at least one person. This is an individual that is a former enlisted serviceman, U.S. military veteran, and also an immigrant here in the United States. U.S. troops are trained to follow orders. They're not trained to question those orders. How difficult is it for these folks to break out of that mindset?
Oh, I think it's really hard for people in that situation. At the same time, I would say that most military people have trained for situations where perhaps you're doing a certain duty, but should the unit come under attack, suddenly you have a different set of duties and responsibilities, and there's a split second to decide what to do. And I think there are people who are concerned. What if that happens here in the U.S. with citizens? Those are real concerns people have, and I think that's why they don't want to be in that position.
So in a situation specifically like the one here in Los Angeles where the protests broke out, the National Guard was sent out, then the Marines were deployed, what does the Uniform Code of Military Justice say is lawful or unlawful when, for instance, Marines are facing off against protesters within the borders of the United States?
Right. So if you've ever looked at the UCMJ, it doesn't get into really particular details, like you're supposed to do this, but not this, or if you do this, there's a punishment. It leaves a lot of things open to what I would call orders and command discretion. So that you get orders saying, here's what we're going to be doing here. Here's the rules of engagement. And if you say, no, I'm not going to do that, well, then the UCMJ has an article where you could be charged for refusing a law or failure to obey a lawful order. And you could be punished at multiple levels for that, depending on command discretion and, how severe they think it is and what they think is appropriate.
But it's not necessarily illegal to question an order, or is it? Because at the same time, the question they could also be asking a question: is it lawful to open fire? Just to underline the fact that we're talking about very young people in many instances here, 17, 18-year-olds walking around with very big guns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think in a situation like that, when a unit comes under attack, I would leave this to attorneys to sort out. I think the LA demonstrations, to my understanding, were largely nonviolent. And at the same time, the people I'm talking to, I think they just want to avoid the whole thing altogether by not having to play this role within the country.
Right. And why call you instead of just going through either the chain of command or the military itself?
Right. Well, I think you make a good point. If the military was covering all of the needs of service members, my phone would be very quiet because people wouldn't need to call. People reach out when there's problems. They aren't calling us to say everything's going great. There are people who are asking their commands hard questions. And I think that's because people feel like just talking about disobeying orders might get you in trouble. They're scared.
More with Steve Woolford after the break. Steve, I want to ask you about former members of the U.S. military. Let's talk about veterans, because there have been many U.S. veterans who have been very outspoken.
We're here at the Capitol, rushing it. We got people in the green action, people on the red. Here we go.
Just last weekend, there was a protest by veterans against these raids by ICE outside of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. There is something interesting happening here. This is a movement, essentially, by former military personnel protesting against what President Trump is doing with these ICE raids. And you're also seeing an uptick in phone calls from veterans. What does this signal to you?
Well, the veteran community in the U.S. is a huge community. And within it, there are veterans I know of who have looked back on their career and they're really upset about what they participated in. They're against war altogether. For a lot of veterans, there's a concern that they see a country that might be moving away from even being a constitutional democracy anymore. And in their minds, I think what determines what direction the country might go in is whether it's not necessarily a president moving towards something else, but it's whether the military follows, whether the military supports that move. So there are a lot of veterans that seem really scared that this is the brink of something much bigger than what's happening in California. I think they feel like they're really worried the country is moving into a different direction, and they want the safeguard to be people in the military refusing to go along with it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's interesting that you're listening to so many of these stories. Steve, let's zoom out a little bit. We're talking about the United States, but let's talk about the United States' role globally as well. As you know, Al Jazeera is an international news network. The Take is an international news show. Maybe it's not hard to understand, but from your perspective, answering these phone calls, are you getting questions about troops having to serve in wars abroad outside of the United States?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been doing this for, I think, around 25 years. And I started just before September 11th. And I would say prior to that, there were recruiters who might sell the military to a young person as saying, look, we don't really go to other countries and fight anymore. This is job training. It's going to help you. They talk about the career. And I mean, sometimes recruiters are suspicious in what they say, but I think their own experiences might have made that seem like a fairly reasonable thing to say. After September 11th, I think the mindset changed dramatically to people thinking this is about going to war. Again, that the military is a huge community. There are people who will do exactly what they're told, and there's people who even believe in the government's decisions. But there are other people who say, I don't feel good about this. Or sometimes just the thought of, I'm actually going to be shooting at some other guy whose government is just making him shoot against me. I'm not sure that I'm as into that as I originally thought I was going to be. So it's not a brand new thing for people we work with to question war in general. I doubt it's the majority of people.
Do you get people calling in concerned about what's happening in Gaza, for example?
Absolutely.
And the United States' continued support for Israel?
So there were a number of people who called us who said, I'm looking at the news and I don't feel like I can support this thing. And I know right now we're not the troops on the ground, but I feel like our country is supporting this thing. And I'm seeing blown up buildings and blown up schools and blown up hospitals. And so there were a lot of people who were upset. I've had people who have already been discharged for conscientious objection, where I think the final thing that awakened that in them was what was happening in Palestine. So there's always people who have doubts about, hey, this war, is this being fought over something I believe in? Those are questions we get all the time.
Yeah. You know what this makes me think of? It reminds me of the case of Aaron Bushnell, who is a former U.S. Air Force service member who self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. in protest to Israel's war on Gaza. I guess the question is, what does that make you think about the resources that are available to enlisted members or even veterans who want to dissent?
When we talk about Aaron Bushnell, I don't know that having greater access to free speech would have led him to do something. I don't know him, and I don't know what decisions went into his choices. So, I mean, obviously he felt very, very passionately about the issue, and in some way felt like he was giving his life for a transformation. But I don't, if someone asked me, can you design a policy to make sure service members don't feel that way? I think if the conflicts are going to be there in the world, I think there's going to be service members that have concerns and want to interrupt it. And I don't know that there's going to be any kind of avenue that makes them feel like they've registered enough dissent to be okay. It sounded like, nothing short of giving his life was going to be enough for him.
Steve Woolford, thank you so much for joining us on The Take.
Well, thank you for being here and giving attention to this issue. It matters to a lot of people.
And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you'll find all our recent content uploaded regularly so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera. See you tomorrow.